What if I told you the bloodiest war in Latin America's history didn't happen in a city, or even on a map, but in a jungle that hated both armies? A place where men died of thirst before they ever saw the enemy, where tanks melted in the heat, and ghosts were made by silence, not bullets. This is the war the world forgot, but the jungle remembers. I'm Arturo, and this is LatinLora. From Latin America's history, to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue, every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. They called it a desert, but it breathed like a jungle and swallowed armies whole. The Gran Chaco, a stretch of land so flat, so forsaken, so unyielding, that even maps seemed to give up halfway through. It lay like a bruise on the border of two hungry nations, Bolivia and Paraguay. But this was no borderland of villages and signposts, no man's land perhaps, or everyone's, a place so hostile to life that it tempted only the most desperate, those with something to prove or something to avenge. In 1932, South America was already bleeding from other wounds. The memory of the War of the Pacific haunted Bolivia like a ghost that wouldn't be buried. Decades earlier, Chile had stripped it of its only coast. Landlocked now, Bolivia stared east toward the Chaco with a thirst that went beyond water. That land, useless to some, sacred to others, was Bolivia's last perceived path to the Atlantic, through the river Paraguay and then down to the sea. What had once been seen as worthless was now rumored to hold oil beneath its cracked skin, and oil could mean redemption, but Paraguay saw the Chaco differently. For Paraguayans, it wasn't just territory, it was dignity. After the devastation of the War of the Triple Alliance, where the country had lost most of its male population, Paraguay had learned how to survive against the odds. The Chaco was its spine, the river was its breath, and the whisper that Bolivia wanted to take it echoed like a dagger in the national memory. There was no formal declaration. No dramatic speech, just dust, a flag, and a mistake. The first real blood was spilled near a hidden lagoon called Pidiantuta, a place known only to the indigenous people who lived among the trees. Bolivia sent men to seize it. Paraguay struck back. Forts fell. Tempers rose. And then came Boquerón, a single word, heavy as fate. The green hell had awakened. Boquerón was not a city. It wasn't even a town, just a dot in the scrub. A fort made of wood and willpower. But in September 1932, it became the center of a storm. On one side, Paraguay, 7,500 men led by a quiet genius named José Félix Estigarribia, who had once walked the Chaco on foot and now commanded it with maps no one else believed in. On the other hand, Bolivia, hundreds holed up in the fort under the command of Manuel Marzana, surrounded, sweating, running out of everything but pride. Estigarribia had a plan: encircle, starve, break them with thirst. The air shimmered with heat. Buzzards traced circles overhead. The men dug trenches with their bare hands. Mosquitoes danced on bleeding skin. Ammunition was rationed. So was water. 1 cup a day. If you were lucky, soldiers dipped their shirts in the last pools to moisten their tongues. Bolivian planes rumbled overhead, dropping supplies that never landed. They exploded, missed, or were seized by the Paraguayan lines. The siege tightened, and then, after 3 weeks of hell, the silence was louder than the gunfire had ever been. On September 29th, out of bullets and out of breath, Marzana surrendered. Paraguay had won its first major battle, but at a cost. Hundreds dead, more wounded. A nation wounded and vindicated at once. Estigarribia stood amid the carnage, knowing this was only the beginning. The Chaco had tasted blood, and it wanted more. In La Paz, the news of Boquerón struck like a slap. Bolivia, 3 times richer and larger, armed to the teeth with German steel and British engines, had been humiliated. The people demanded a savior. So the government turned to a ghost from its past, Hans Kunt, the Prussian general who had trained their officers decades before and wore his medals like prophecies. They believed he would march into the Chaco and fix everything. But the jungle doesn't care for medals, and the Chaco cannot be read like a European battlefield. Kunt came with precision, but not with intuition. He drew lines on maps as if they were roads. He called for tanks in a place without roads. He demanded speed where mud clutched boots to the earth. Still, he had firepower, artillery by the dozens, airplanes that scouted and strafed, columns of soldiers trained in alpine wind now panting in 100-degree heat. His target was Nanawa, a name that would burn itself into history. January 1933, Bolivia threw 20,000 men, tanks, and aircraft at a Paraguayan position built like a fortress out of mud, sweat, and barbed wire. Trenches snaked through the bush like scars. Machine guns stitched death into every Bolivian advance. Estigarribia didn't move. He held. And in his stillness was strategy. When Kunt tried again in July, he came with flamethrowers and new fury. Paraguayan soldiers, armed with rifles older than their fathers, fought back with ingenuity. They used Molotovs against the tanks. They turned every trench into a trap. They shot, fell back, then struck again from the side. The Bolivians had technology, but Paraguay had timing. After 2 battles, Bolivia had gained nothing but graves. Kunt's mystique crumbled. In the Chaco, it wasn't your uniform that mattered. It was how long you could go without water, how quietly you could flank, how quickly you could dig. Kunt had brought Europe to the jungle, but the Chaco had no patience for foreigners. If Boquerón was the baptism and Nanawa the trial, Campo Vía was the exorcism. Late 1933, Bolivia, bruised and bitter, had driven itself deep into the Chaco. Thousands of troops stretched across the scrub like a line drawn too long. Estigarribia saw his chance. He called in his commanders. No bluster, no fireworks. Just a quiet voice and a brilliant mind. The plan was ancient and perfect, a double envelopment. Paraguayan forces fanned out wide, not through roads, they didn't exist, but through picadas, narrow trails cut by machete. In 3 days they moved with silence and speed. When they struck, the Bolivian line snapped like dry wood, trapped, surrounded, cut off from water and supply. Bolivians began to collapse, not just in formations, but in spirit. What Estigarribia's troops captured was staggering. 8,000 soldiers, 250 officers, 60 mortars, 24 artillery pieces, 80 trucks, thousands of rifles and machine guns. A treasure trove for a poor country and a death knell for an army running out of hope. In La Paz, General Kunt's career ended that night. He left not with glory, but with questions. How could this happen? How could a nation with tanks and aircraft lose to a nation of barefoot soldiers, drinking from rain puddles and fighting with second-hand rifles? The answer was buried in the sand. Paraguay had planned, Paraguay had adapted, and Paraguay had endured. Campo Vía was more than a victory. It was a reversal of fate. From that moment on, Bolivia was not on the offensive. It was running, and the Chaco watched it all with ancient, silent eyes. By 1934, the war had changed its shape. No longer a tug of war over scattered forts. It had become a battle of logistics, of thirst, of movement without roads. Estigarribia pushed deeper into the Chaco Seco, the dry Chaco, where even ghosts would have asked for water before haunting the place. The deeper Paraguay advanced, the more the jungle turned against them. Here, the sun was not hot. It was predatory. It stripped skin from bone and left lips cracked like desert floors. Water became more than a resource. It became an obsession. Soldiers rationed gulps. Men risked their lives digging for hidden springs. Pocheros, well diggers, became saints. And when they struck water, you'd hear cheers more joyous than any battlefield cry. Paraguay had to adapt. They brought 6,000 head of cattle with them, live and walking, a moving food supply through thorns and heat. At the same time, 2,000 tons of fuel, food, ammunition, and medicine had to be transported each month across sand, swamp, and mud. Everything that moved groaned. The Paraguayan army was not without its breaking points. Trucks stalled in the dust. Fuel ran dry. Communications fell silent. And yet Estigarribia pushed on, not with speed, but with precision. His map wasn't just a battlefield. It was a living thing, marked by wells, trails, tree lines, and whispers from the native guides. One wrong move, and an entire battalion could vanish without a bullet fired, claimed not by the enemy, but by thirst. Irandagüe proved the lesson. A Paraguayan column flanked and captured the only water sources in the area. 2 Bolivian divisions trapped in the sun without shade or water. They didn't fight, they didn't retreat, they died. They died by the hundreds, marching with their tongues swollen, collapsing into their own shadows. By the time the order came to pull back, it was too late. Their bodies littered the trails like abandoned uniforms. Victory in the Chaco did not come from guns alone. It came from knowing where the water lived and being there first. By late 1934, Paraguay had done the impossible. It had pushed Bolivia out of the Chaco, not just from the eastern forts, but from the scrub itself, all the way to the edge of the Andes. But now came the most dangerous temptation of war, to go too far. President Salamanca of Bolivia, desperate and furious, took a bold step. He left La Paz and went to the front. He wanted to replace Peñaranda right there in the dust. But Salamanca no longer commanded the army. The army instead turned on him. The president of Bolivia was detained at gunpoint. He was forced to resign in the middle of a war zone, replaced not by voters, not by generals, but by pressure. The war had twisted his nation's spine, and now Bolivia belonged to the colonels. Peñaranda kept command, but the cracks were evident. Bolivia was building a new army of 50,000 men, digging trenches, stacking artillery near Villamontes, their last bastion. If Paraguay took it, the road to Tarija and Bolivia's oil would lie open. Estigarribia wanted to break it. He didn't just want a line, he wanted a severed artery to cut the road between Santa Cruz and Villamontes. In January 1935, Carandaiti fell. Then Boyuibi. Paraguayan troops surged like fire through dry brush. But then, finally, Bolivia answered. At Ñaycoraza, Paraguayan forces were flanked and pushed back. At Villamontes, Estigarribia struck and was repelled. His men, hardened by 3 years of victory, had hit a wall. The terrain had changed, and so had the enemy. The war was nearing its crescendo, and both nations were bleeding from wounds no medicine could heal. Bolivia had lost land. Paraguay had nearly lost its soul from exhaustion. And still, the thorny jungle whispered to no one whose side it was on. The green hell had taught Paraguay how to win. Now it was teaching them how to stop. After Villamonte pushed them back, Estigarribia changed direction, not out of defeat, but out of cunning. He set his eyes on something even more vital than a city, Camiri, the heart of Bolivia's petroleum lifeline, where wells and pumps gurgled up the fuel of a modern army. If Paraguay could reach it, the message would be louder than any shell. We can take your breath. The terrain turned from cruel to impossible. Sand turned to sludge. The rain washed out every road. Cattle dropped dead in their own hoofprints. And the men who had once fought for territory were now fighting to move. But still they advanced, slowly, doggedly. Then came the realization they had gone too far. Paraguay's supply lines were stretched like spiderwebs across the Chaco, 600 kilometers of broken ground between their front line and their river lifeline. Ammunition was scarce. Artillery shells came from Argentina. Planes were few. There were no bombs to drop on Camiri, and the one bridge that mattered, the one over the Pilcomayo, still stood, untouched, too far to destroy. The soldiers still fought, but the soul of the army had begun to whisper doubts. Back in Asunción, the nation was on its knees. 16-year-old boys and men in their 60s were now recruits. Hospitals overflowed. Supplies were paper thin. The regiments that had marched in at full strength now limped forward with a third of their numbers. And still they pushed on, until finally Estigarribia paused. He had led his people from survival to superiority. He had gutted a superior army and written doctrine with his boots, but he knew the truth of war. There is a point where victory becomes defeat if you do not stop. Bolivia was not dead. It was transforming. Out of the shattered bones of Campo Vía, out of the failed sieges and thirst-plagued retreats, came a new Bolivian army. Not elegant, not precise, but stubborn. They dug deep near Villamontes, trenches by the hundreds, bunkers stuffed with artillery, thousands of fresh men who hadn't yet heard the jungle's whisper, and behind them, the Andes. It was a shift in altitude, in strategy, and in fortune. In April 1935, Bolivia pushed back in the mountains. For the first time, Paraguay's army met something colder than itself. The thin air stole strength, the steep terrain stole movement, and Bolivia's defenders were now fighting in terrain they knew better than anyone. Paraguay was exhausted, spiritually, logistically, humanly. Their war machine, once a marvel of improvisation, was breaking down. They had no aircraft capable of bombing the oil fields. Their motor pool was starving for fuel. Their hospitals had turned into warehouses of suffering. And their generals knew what their men were too proud to say. They were running on fumes. The successful campaign of 1934 had left behind a long, exposed tail. Every extra mile conquered had become a new liability. Every captured fort was now a supply drain. Estigarribia didn't need orders to understand what was next. He turned his eyes back toward his maps, no longer looking for objectives, but for limits. He had pushed the line of battle to the border of dreams. But nations do not live on dreams alone. They live on breath, food, and will. And Paraguay's will, though stronger than anyone had imagined, was now thin as gauze. It was time to speak of peace. But not yet. The jungle had one more trap, and Bolivia, battered but burning with defiance, stepped right into it. In early June 1935, Bolivia launched a final offensive, one last reach toward the river, the sea, the dream. They aimed at Ingavi, a forgotten northern sector that Paraguay had left only lightly defended. The goal, break through, reach a port on the Paraguay River, and twist the story in the war's final chapter. But once again, Estigarribia was faster than maps. He saw the shift in momentum, not as desperation, but as opportunity. Bolivia had overreached again. And Paraguay, even with fewer men, even with rusted guns and broken trucks, still held its most significant weapon, the power of encirclement. Like in Campo Vía, Estigarribia struck from the sides. Paraguay's maneuver warfare, trained in silence, sharpened in pain, surrounded the new Bolivian column before it could taste victory. There was no room to retreat, no water to drink, no shelter from the heat. The soldiers of the Andean Plateau, once taught to march like Prussians, now sat in thorny mud, staring at their boots, wondering how they'd been outflanked again by a smaller, starving, half-silent army in rags. And then they surrendered. No headlines, no parades, just silence, and the creeping realization that this was the end. Because if Bolivia kept fighting, they would lose everything, again, not just forts, but faith. On June 12, 1935, in Buenos Aires, under quiet chandeliers and the pressure of survival, the armistice was signed. The war was over. Paraguay emerged victorious, its flag planted not just over territory, but over history. It held the Chaco Boreal. It had achieved the impossible, defeating a richer, larger, better equipped adversary through cunning, endurance, and terrain mastery. But it had come at a terrible price. Paraguay lost 36,000, more than 3% of its population. A whole generation shattered. Bolivia lost even more, between 56,000 and 65,000, a scar that pulsed through its politics for decades. No one returned from the Chaco untouched. The war did not end with a roaring victory. It ended with a whisper, the sound of water dripping from a broken canteen, the moan of a soldier dreaming of home in a trench still hot from yesterday's fire. And when they marched home, there were no flowers, only silence. José Félix Estigarribia would be made marshal and later president, but he died just 4 years after the war in a plane crash, his country still healing. Eusebio Ayala, the president who managed the war's finances like a maestro, lived to see Paraguay free of debt, but burdened with ghosts. Bolivia, shamed and bitter, slipped into revolution. Colonels overthrew the president, and the country turned inward, as if hoping to forget the dust that swallowed its sons. The Chaco War remains a war of paradoxes, a modern war with tanks, airplanes, and machine guns fought in a prehistoric landscape, a war over a land no one wanted, but everyone feared to lose, a war without a single famous battle cry, but with thousands of whispered prayers and dozens of dying languages. And yet, it is perhaps the most Latin American war of them all. It wasn't about glory, it was about stubbornness. It wasn't about strategy, it was about logistics and the art of dragging your boots 1 mile farther than the man in front of you. And most of all, it wasn't about oil, it was about identity, about proving that a small nation, written off by maps and mocked by neighbors, could look a giant in the eye and not blink. The Chaco is quiet now. Its forts have returned to dust. The birds have reclaimed the sky. The jungle, as always, forgets, but we don't, because somewhere, still buried in the thorn and the silence, is the echo of a truth too painful and too beautiful to ignore. In the green hell, Latin America found its soul. Gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.